Hello, everybody. Today, we're going to be talking about problem solving and how you can dramatically enhance your abilities to solve a problem. Over the last 6 months or so, I've been absolutely obsessed and enamored with the notion of problem solving. I researched the cognitive processes that go on when we're solving a problem adroitly, and more importantly, what exactly can we do and implement so that we can become greater problem solvers? Okay, let's begin with step one. Identify and recognize the problem at hand. So often we fail to even fathom what's in front of us. We fail to identify the very problem at hand. Therefore, we can't even ascribe the win conditions to solve the problem. So, what happens when you truly recognize and identify the problem? Well, let's begin with concept number one: perception. Perception is a necessary tool that we use to recognize and identify a problem. Perception is the initial sensory intake of what the problem propels, what exactly we're looking at. Perception allows us to limit the very problem space itself. It allows us to deconstruct the principles, to add on the fundamentals, the rules, the constraints. It formalizes the problem space so that we can navigate the problem itself. Think of perception as an internal gatekeeper. This gatekeeper in our minds is constantly filtering in and out information. It allows relevant, crucial, fundamental, axiomatic information to get through the gate, while discarding and admonishing the information that isn't vital, crucial, at hand, and that seems redundant. Things that are irrelevant, right? It discards all of that. So perception is a beautiful thing that allows us to identify the problem. So, for example, let's go with El Lawlet. El Lawlet is a character from Death Note, the main antagonist, and he's in a situation where he's observing Light Yagami, the main character, who's able to write down people's names and kill them in his magical notebook. At this point of the story, Light Yagami actually wiped his own memories, and he went back to a more virtuous, kind-hearted, and innocent version of Light. And this change was screaming at El. His perception detected this anomaly that we talked about earlier and helped him identify the problem at hand. So El was able to discern in some way. He may not comprehended or completely fathomed what he was looking at, but his perception was so keen that was able to discern and draw this change in behavior. And that brings me to my second point, the second concept regarding the first step: pattern recognition. Pattern recognition is the ability to identify, interpret, and predict reoccurring information, classifying and generalizing information within a set of data, if you will. So here's an interesting thing. El actually was able to accumulate and draw a profile of who Light was as Kira, the mass murderer, and he denoted his tendencies, his verbiage, and his general orientation of how he went about his life. And when Light forgoed and relinquished his memories, it changed in an instant, and El was able to perceive such a thing, thus helping him identify and recognize the problem at hand. And via his perception and via his pattern recognition, he was able to do so. Okay, now let's come up with our own example, our own problem, right? And let's go with more of an ill-defined problem. So let's say you're trying to figure out and quantify how loyal somebody is. Yes, this is how universal and upright a problem can be. We can go from a mathematical equation, a puzzle, a case, to a completely ambiguous and equivocal problem such as quantifying the loyalty of somebody. So let's say you're observing the vice president of the classics club at your university or school, and you want to figure out how loyal this person is. And so the problem at hand would be how loyal he is, and us trying to figure out how loyal this person is, right? Our perception allows us to figure out and hone in on the concept of loyalty itself, and more importantly, or maybe not more importantly, but just as important, the opposite of loyalty: disloyalty, treachery, untrustworthiness. things and concepts that directly contradict what a loyal person would be. Even something like apathy, or being completely lukewarm and detached and neutral from another person can be seen as unloyal at times. And so that's what our perception does. It limits the space. It sort of filters out things like courage and bravery and compassion, and allows us to keen in on just loyalty and also the opposite of loyalty. And then our pattern recognition allows us to classify the different sets of behaviors that make somebody loyal, and also the behaviors that deviate and are irregular from our pattern of loyalty. We all have experiences of what being loyal is, of what loyalty looks like. And our pattern recognition allows us to detect, oh, this is different from the pattern of what loyalty is, and therefore allows us to conduct ourselves in a way that we can figure out, oh, this person is not loyal, or this person is only a little bit of loyal, right? And so that's the beauty of perception and pattern recognition. And pattern recognition actually works exactly off of perception. Your perception allows you to recognize the different patterns or non-patterns. Okay, now let's talk about step 2. Step 2 is define and mentally represent the problem. So now that we have identified and recognized the problem, we now have to define it and mentally represent it in our heads. And what goes on when you define a problem is actually called comprehension. Comprehension is the sequence and the next step to our perception. First we perceive, and then we comprehend. Comprehension is turning our perception into a working narrative. It's how deeply you can understand and fathom a problem at hand. It's how you structure and organize the variables, the operators, the solution paths in your problem. Comprehension allows you to critically assess what you're looking at. It assigns value and cohesion to all of your perceptions in your head that you haven't fully fathomed and organized properly. Comprehension is a beautiful tool that we all possess as human beings, and it is the most crucial thing in order to define something. And so now that we know how to define something via our comprehension, how do we mentally represent it? Okay, so before we get into that, let's talk about our example, right, of the loyalty concept. So comprehension in this case would be how deep our understanding of loyalty is. We've perceived and honed in on the concept of loyalty via our identification of it. Now we have to understand how deep it runs, and our comprehension is how deeply we understand loyalty in this case for our problem. So now how do we mentally represent a problem? Okay, this is a concept known as visualization. Visualization is probably in my top 3 most important factors for problem solving. It actually changed my life when it came to problem solving. It's such a fascinating topic. So visualization is the 3D rendering and the picturesque meaning of the words and comprehension in our head. We have all these words, right, when we comprehend something. It's in our head somewhere, but we haven't visualized it into a physical and 3D manner in our heads. We haven't sequenced it in a event form, in a narrative, if you will. It turns our working narrative into a picturesque viewpoint of the problem. And the beauty of visualization is it allows us to fully investigate what we're looking at. It makes the problem navigable. It makes it graspable. Okay, so let's go back to our example of the vice president of the classics club, right? Remember, we're trying to figure out how loyal this person is. So visualization allows us to fully fathom the operators at hand. So for example, let's say you finally identified and defined the problem at hand, and now you're like, okay, I need to observe him to understand how loyal this person is. And you observe him at the mall, and at the mall he's with his family. And you notice that he's texting his phone a lot. And he's only texting back one person, which is the president of the Classics Club. And you're like, oh, he's relinquishing time with his family. He's disassociating from them to text back the president of the Classics Club. That's fascinating. And then all of a sudden, you observe him with the president, and he's in closer proximity with the president than anybody else you observed him with. You've recognized the patterns of how he is with his family and his other friends, but then you recognize the patterns of how he is with the president, and there's a deviation, there's a difference. He's in closer proximity with the president. You also observe that he does more tedious tasks for the president. He nods his head more when he's with the president than any other person. And after all, I said all of this, what did you do? You visualized this person within these different contexts and doing these different behaviors. That's the beauty of visualization. You have now just represented the problem at hand. You now have given loyalty a 3D rendering, a visual premise. Visualizing the problem at hand is crucial because now you can inspect it, you can manipulate it in such a way that allows you to solve the problem so much more swiftly and with great celerity. So the final concept within step 2, which is define and mentally represent the problem, is this concept known as cognitive flexibility. So remember, we talked about comprehension, visualization, and now the third thing, cognitive flexibility. Cognitive flexibility is essentially a conscious recalibration of our perspectives and our thoughts, of our frameworks. Things like being vicarious, thinking from another person's perspective, completely shifting our perspective, our interpretation, our framing of an event, of a stimuli, of our observation is cognitive flexibility. An objective way of critically analyzing a viewpoint from a separate viewpoint. So for example, in the example of our loyalty situation, remember we observed that he's texting back the president at the mall with his family being there. We've observed that he nods his head more when he's with the president and that he's always in closer proximity with the president, which may indicate signs of loyalty. But cognitive flexibility is taking those observation, is taking those interpretations and completely shifting them. So now you're like, okay, let's think from the perspective of the vice president. Cognitive flexibility allows you to be like, okay, wait, the vice president also wants to be president. And the president is actually graduating, and he's the one that chooses who the next president is. Is the vice president only doing these behaviors because he wants to be president? Yeah, he may be showing signs of loyalty, but what are the root causes of the loyalty? Maybe he's only in closer proximity because he only wants to be seen by the president and no one else. Maybe he texts him back because he wants to gain favor from the president. Cognitive flexibility allows you to not, it doesn't allow you to make judgments of things, right? But it allows you to make better judgments because you think of things from different perspectives at a quick shift. Okay, now let's talk about step 3. Step 3 is develop a solution strategy. Now we can finally project our idealizations of the problem at hand. Remember, we've identified and recognized the problem. We've defined and mentally represented it. We have all these thoughts looming in our heads, and now it's finally time to project a solution strategy. The first thing you must do when you do want to develop a solution strategy is this thing known as analogical transfer. Analogical transfer is a brilliant strategy that you can employ when the situation at hand is analogous to a past situation. It's taking a past solution structure, a solution path, a past operator, a variable that can help you with a new problem, and simply transferring it over. Analogical transfer is actually done by the best problem solvers. It's quite akin to pattern recognition, but it's more so the application of the pattern recognition, the stored experiences and underlying structures of your past problems and solutions. So take Sherlock Holmes, for example. Sherlock Holmes actually does this in every single one of his cases. So this is what he's quoted before. As a clue when I have heard some indication of the course of events, I am able to guide myself by the thousands of other similar cases which occur to my memory. So Sherlock Holmes himself, when he does hear some indication of a new case, he goes through his memory and he naturally excavates solutions and experiences from those cases and transfers it. Analogical transfer is one of the most powerful strategies you can do. However, most times problems can be novel. They can be nebulous and completely unforeseen. And in order to get that clairvoyance to overcome them, you must do this thing known as analogical negation, which is understanding that, okay, this problem is not akin or analogous to any problem I've had in the past. What do I do now? And now there's a lot of different strategies you can implement. For example, the hill climbing strategy. The hill climbing strategy is a branch off heuristics. Heuristics is essentially mental shortcuts. It allows us to get to solution A to Z in a swift and efficient manner. The hill climbing strategy is essentially this conscious framework, and you must be conscious when you're doing this. So it's essentially understanding where you are at during the situation of the problem. Where is my current placement of the problem? Like, what is my current standing? Understanding your current place and simply trying to become a little bit better. Simply climbing the rate of solving, of the solution. And so it can be seen as a tedious solution, but it's so efficient and it's so effective because every single action you take is to get better than the previous state you were in. I know it may sound bland or repetitive, but when you're consciously trying to get to a little bit better than where you were, you can truly solve a problem in such a swift manner through the hill climbing strategy. The next strategy you can do, which is also a branch off heuristics, is called the means end analysis. The means end analysis is essentially taking the beginning state, the current analysis of where you are, and the goal state. It's analyzing the differences between where you are now and the goal state. It's kind of similar to the hill climbing strategy, but it's much more of a leap. It's essentially saying, okay, what is the one task? What are the certain sets of actions I can take to get closer to the end goal? So the hill climbing strategy was just trying to get 1% or 10% or 30% better. The means end analysis is saying, what is the best possible leap I can do to get from point A to point B in the fastest, most efficient, and most effective way possible? And now imagine combining the two, the hill climbing strategy and the means end analysis, and you have quite the formidable heuristic at your hands. The next strategy you can do is called the Newell and Simon, or first principles strategy. You can call it whatever, but for this case, we're going to call it the Newell and Simon approach. The Newell and Simon approach is essentially taking the problem at hand and decomposing it into chunks and sub-goals. So you take whatever problem, let's go with our example of the loyalty conundrum. So remember, we're trying to figure out how loyal the vice president is of the Classics Club. And now chunking it or putting that quantification of loyalty into sub-goals would be like, okay, how does he act around his friends? How does he act around his family? How does he act around the president? What are his self-perceptions of loyalty? Can we figure out what loyalty means and how it's exhibited within his behavior? So these are examples of taking the concept of loyalty and putting it into sub-goals. And then the first principles approach allows us to be like, okay, what are the non-negotiable truths, the axioms, the objective, universal placements that I cannot overlook or manipulate in any single way, the non-malleable concepts? So that's looking at loyalty at its purest form, defining what that means to not only to you, but to the vice president. What is his own perception of what loyalty looks like? How does he give the absolute purest loyalty? And starting from there, and then making more assumptions, then making more conjunctions, more associations to what you believe his loyalty looks like. The next strategy that you can do is this thing known as inversion. Inversion is essentially taking the opposite of what you're trying to solve and solving the very opposite. So in our case, we're trying to figure out how loyal the vice president is, but instead inversion would be like, okay, how tepid, how untrustworthy, how aloof, how somber, how disassociative is he to another person? That would be inversion, trying to figure out the opposite of what loyalty means to the vice president and trying to observe behaviors or any sort of indications that solve the opposite, and therefore allows you to solve the actual problem at hand, the quantification of his loyalty. So that's inversion. Inversion is actually quite useful to a lot of set of ill-defined problems. The final strategy or solution strategy to solve a problem is arguably the most formidable and absolute out of all of them. Insight. Insight may be the most powerful tool we possess as cognitive creatures to overcome any sort of problem that may impede us. Do you remember perception, how we defined perception back then as this gatekeeper, filtering in relevant information and discarding irrelevant? Well, perception is actually the reorganization and restructuring of our very perception. Think of it as like the judge that oversees the gatekeeper itself. the one that monitors the gatekeeper's behavior. And so insight can actually be drawn to three concepts, because insight is quite the complicated thing. But insight can be, derived into three concepts. And so the first concept is known as selective encoding. Selective encoding is taking information that was irrelevant back then and making it relevant. So this is telling the gatekeeper, wait, you missed something. You shouldn't have let this piece of variable, this piece of information go. Actually, we want this piece of information to come into our gate. It's making the irrelevant into relevant. So in our example, this would be taking a past point of behavior that we deemed as irrelevant and making it relevant. So for example, you observe the head nodding, you observe the closer proximity, you observe the texting back, you observe the tedious task that he would complete for the president, but you overlooked the eye contact, how he rarely, seldom broke eye contact with the president. You initially deemed that as relevant, but now you're like, maybe eye contact in conjunction with proximity is relevant all of a sudden. So that would be selective encoding. And this is a factor of insight, because remember, insight is a subconscious process. Do you ever take a shower? You should take lots of showers, but are you ever in the shower and all of a sudden you think of something that will help you with whatever you're dealing with? Or you're on a walk and all of a sudden this stroke of intuition, rather insight, just hits you. And you're thinking about all of these things, whether they can be high in quantity and even quality. And you're like, whoa, how did I process all of that in a heartbeat? That's insight. And selective encoding, taking the irrelevant to the relevant, is part of that. So the second factor within insight is known as selective combination. Selective combination is taking a non-obvious framework and making it a coherent whole. So this one is probably the most complicated by definition, but very intuitive once you understand it. So in our example, this would be thinking about how proximity, how the vice president is so close within proximity with the president, and being like, wait a minute, proximity is actually connected to him completing tedious tasks. Remember, we observed two separate things, how the vice president is closer in proximity and how the vice president does more tedious tasks for the president that make the vice president usually acrimonious, but when he's doing it for the president, he's more jubilant as he's doing it. It's connecting the proximity to the task itself. It's being like, wait a minute, observing when the vice president does do a task, a tedious, bland, banal task for the president, he's usually in closer proximity with the president when he's doing it. It's taking that non-obvious framework and connecting it into a coherent whole. All of a sudden, your two observations now have synergy to them. That's selective combination. The third and final piece to insight is my personal favorite. It's called selective comparison. Selective comparison is so cool because it takes a non-obvious piece of information in the past, like your prior knowledge, and connects your prior knowledge to newly found knowledge. So in our example of the vice president and his loyalty would be this. Let's talk about proximity again. You observe that he's in close proximity with the president, and you realize and you recall your studies of Milgram's obedience experiments. And in Milgram's experiments, Milgram directly stated that proximity, if someone is closer to another person, it means that they defer to them more. It means that they're more obedient to them. And all of a sudden, from that experiment, you then associate and link, wait, obedience can be a faculty, it could be a byproduct or a direct correspondence with loyalty. If someone is more obedient to someone, that means they're more loyal to them in a way. That's the connection you make. And all of a sudden, the closer in proximity observation holds so much more merit, and it's so much more valid in terms of quantifying the loyalty of the vice president because you made this selective comparison. Okay, now let's talk about step 4. And we're actually not even done. You may have thought that, oh, we developed a strategy, therefore we're done. No, not even close. We still have 2 more steps to go. And step 4 is this. Step 4 is allocating the proper mental resources onto the problem. So why do we need to allocate mental resources? Well, in order to answer that question, let's begin with what makes a problem difficult? According to psychologists, the difficulty of a problem is how hard it is to relax your current rules and assumptions and break the problem into workable parts. It's being able to decompose the problem at hand. It's not necessarily cognitive load. how quantifiable is the problem? How much of a strain does it take on our memory, on our processing speed, on our attention span? It is also that, but it's more than that. It's how easy it is to chunk the problem. How easy it is to relax our minds. And I don't mean in a more zen, conscious, equanimous manner. No, I mean in a mental manner. How easy it is to systemize, to break down, to govern the whole, and then individualize, singularize the whole. It's very complicated, actually, this whole definition of what makes a problem difficult, but it essentially is that, relaxing the constraints and how easy it is for you to decompose a problem. So therefore, a more difficult problem would have more arduous concepts that are much more harder to decompose, that are much more harder to fathom, that are much more harder to sort of externalize in a way. And so how do we allocate our mental resources properly, and how do we overcome more difficult problems? First thing to do is understand constraint relaxation. Remember, in order for problems to become more easy, we have to relax the constraints. We have to relax the cognitive load that is within the problem, and relaxing the constraints is how we do it. And this thing known as externalization. Externalization is essentially just maybe writing down the problem, writing down different variables. You don't have to like memorize as much, because our working memory has a limit. Our working memory has restrictions. And so even writing down the problem and writing down the most difficult variables, and maybe even simplifying the variables through our denotations, can help that tremendously. The next thing you want to do in order to relax your mind is this thing known as attention control, which is the conscious recalibration of where our attention lands. It's dispersing and silencing any distractions and any other information, and honing just in on what you need to hone in on. So for example, if you're using a Newell and Simon approach where you're, putting the goal into sub-goals, it's being able to hone in on one of the sub-goals and just that goal. Attention control is so powerful, and actually I wrote a paper and did some research on how it's even linked to anxiety. It's even linked to neurotic tendencies. Yeah, how you shape your attention can even help with the regulation of your emotions. And so focusing your attention, honing your attention, training your attention, which we can do, is crucial in actually lowering the difficulty of the problem that's at hand. The final thing to understand when allocating the mental resources for a problem, which is step 4, is understanding the importance of working memory. Memory is the core, the linchpin, the most crucial concept we have within cognitive psychology. It is responsible for almost every other cognitive facet that we possess. Memory is everything. And working memory, which is extremely paramount and correspondent and germane within problem solving, is always live. Your memory is always doing something, and so improving your working memory can actually help you solve problems, because it's also linked to fluid reasoning, and that's a whole other conversation. But yeah, work on your working memory. Trust me. Final step, the 5th and final step we have in order to become a better problem solver, is this: monitor progress towards the goal and evaluate the solution. In order to monitor progress, we need to do this thing known as metacognitive realization, metacognitive awareness, metacognitive analysis, and introspection. Metacognition is what allows us to understand systems, frameworks, methodologies, solution paths, why some solutions work. It allows us to truly fathom our thought processes. It allows us to think about our thought processes. It allows us to critically analyze and winnow out the poor and disparaging and sickly thought processes that just are not conducive to any sort of success and that directly hinder our progress. Metacognition within the realm of problem solving allows us to monitor our thoughts, recalibrate our thinking, test our assumptions, understand why solutions work. It's the ultimate judge of judgment and decisions. It allows you to compare your thoughts to reality itself, and therefore helps you learn and understand how to solve the problem. So the next thing you need to do is actually implement and employ this concept known as the ladder of abstraction. The ladder of abstraction is a fascinating and beautiful concept because it's the most subjective and innate to your understanding of the world and your perceptions. So the ladder of abstraction is like this. So for me personally, I have a 10-step ladder. And step one of the ladder is the most concrete, singular, idiosyncratic problem you can come across. It has well-defined rules, well-defined constraints, well-defined solution paths, and the solution is often singular. So this would be things like a mathematical equation, or a puzzle, or a very simple and roundabout game. And then something like a level 10 abstraction would be the most complex in nature. It requires extraordinary proofs. It has a level of analysis that hasn't been seen before. It's so irregular. It's so non-linear. It requires so much divergent and creative thing. It has multiple colliding systems of approach that are attached to it. Everything is equivocal. Everything is nebulous. Everything is cloudy. You have to develop the rules yourself. You have to implement the rules, the wind conditions, the operators. You are the one that's defining everything and philosophizing how you can overcome this level 10 abstraction. But here's an important distinction. The more you go up on the ladder, it doesn't mean a problem is more difficult. It just means it's more abstract and more complex. Remember, complexity isn't always rooted with difficulty. Remember, difficulty is about how easy it is to constrain and to relax the layers of the problem itself, to decompose it in a way. The ladder of abstraction is all about complexity and abstraction. The final thing you need to understand and implement when evaluating the solution and monitoring progress is developing a solution library. A solution library is really cool because it's similar to a memory palace, but it's specific to solutions that you've accrued over time. You solve problem A, and you realize, okay, I should remember the problem, I should remember how I solved it, the solution, and the underlying structure, and you're simply planting that within your solution library. And most importantly, a solution library is your analogical transfer outlet. Do you remember the most important thing and most important strategy that you can do when trying to solve a problem? That's analogical transfer, which is taking a past underlying structure, a past solution path, a past solution, a past variable, a past operator, and directly duplicating and transferring that to the new problem at hand. Well, a solution library allows you to be in situations where you can do more of that, where you can have more analogous transfers. And so that's the beauty of a solution library. You can really take what Sherlock Holmes does almost in every single case and do that for yourself in almost any single situation and for any single problem that may come obstruct you. That's what I have regarding problem solving, and I hope just any of these insights was valuable to you, and maybe you can use it to draw your own inferences. Maybe you don't have to use all the steps in a chronological order. Maybe you take a few and implement them that way, and that's completely fine. I just hope that it can be of use to you. So thank you for watching, and take care.